All right, guys. Well, I'm really glad that Joel asked me to come speak to you guys. And I'm not going to lie, when he first asked me, I was pretty nervous, but I spent a good portion of my 5-hour drive here praying about it. So God's given me a lot of strength because I know that in and of myself, I can't explain to you guys my story and how God kind of worked through the craziness of my life and brought me back to himself. Like you guys know, my name is Mike. I'm Joel's cousin. I live in Louisville, Kentucky right now, but I'm originally from South Florida. That's where I grew up. There's no real good way to start off my story. But I do want to just, before I begin to jump into the details of my story, to bring 3 things to you guys' minds. The first of that is that God has a plan for everyone's life, regardless of if we know what that is at the moment, but he does have a plan for our lives, and that plan does ultimately involve our good. Sometimes we can't see that it's good at the moment because we can't see things from God's perspective. We can't see the whole work of his life, of our lives as he's working good for us, but it is ultimately for our good. And the third thing is just that even when we do suffer, God still is going to use that suffering for our eventual good. It's really hard to see in the moment, but he definitely does eventually use that for our good. A little bit of background. I grew up in a home in South Florida with 2 parents who loved me pretty well. Had a pretty decently normal life until I was about 5 years old. At that time, my dad, who was a construction worker, was driving home from a construction site, and when a woman pulled out in front of him as he was driving 6 miles an hour down the interstate, and he crashed right into her car. At the time, it didn't seem like he had a lot of physical damage to himself. He was just a little sore, which is what you pretty much expect when you get into a really fast accident like that.
What happened to the woman? Was she okay?
Yeah, she was eventually okay. She was, but she was actually worse off at the moment than my dad was. She was pretty bloody. Took her to the hospital and she survived. But at the moment, my dad seemed like he was the lucky one. He got away with no bruises, no cuts, no scrapes. But what we didn't realize is that when he hit the woman's car, he tensed his muscles up so hard that he bent the steering wheel in half. And when he did that, he tore all of the nerves in his back. Didn't know at the moment that was going to lead him eventually into a lifelong cycle of pain. A couple weeks after the accident, started getting really, really bad headaches, started having really bad neck and back pain. Sometimes it was bad enough to where he couldn't get out of bed, and it was really hard to see my dad, who...
Why didn't you take him to a chiropractor? They could have told him what was wrong.
We did take him to the chiropractor, but they didn't know. They didn't say anything was wrong. You can't really see when there's nerve damage because the nerves are so small, so they didn't realize it at the time. That's a good question. But he started to have the really, really bad back pain, the really, really bad headaches, and it continually just got worse and worse. And it eventually got to the point where when I was in middle school, my dad could no longer work because he was just in such excruciating pain that even just getting out of bed in the morning was really, really difficult for him. It was at that time that the doctors began prescribing him really, really heavy doses of pain medicine. Pain medicine that was supposed to help him with his pain, but didn't really do much to touch the pain that he was in. And eventually, as happens a lot of times with people who are put on heavy doses of pain meds, he became really, really addicted to his medication. He would get a full month's supply from his doctor, and in 10 days, he'd have burned through the whole supply. And he was just trying, I know deep down, he was just trying really, really hard to fight the pain, but it was so intense that the medicine that was intended to help my dad actually turned him into a drug addict. Living with a drug addict is not enjoyable at all. There were times when he would steal money from our family to go and buy more of his drugs to help his pain. And it was just it really was a nightmare in the moment. And as all this was happening was as I was growing up through high school. And I mean, high school is already enough of a hard time, trying to get adjusted, trying to make friends, trying to figure out where you fit in, trying to make your family's faith your own. And in the midst of all this struggle, I didn't want to admit it, but I was angry at God. I was very angry that my dad was suffering, and that because of this suffering, it was affecting our entire family. I didn't have a father anymore. I had a drug addict who his only thought was to get more medication to help his pain. My mom didn't have a husband anymore. That made parenting really, really difficult. Fights were often. There were many, many, many times when I would walk into the house and see my parents physically pushing each other back and forth. And there were several times when we had to leave the house, pack our clothes, and leave the house for a couple of days, just because my dad would be so enraged, either because he was on his medicines and high, or because he had ran out of them and was going through withdrawals. We would just have to leave because there was a very real chance that he was gonna hurt one of us. Like I said, I was really struggling during this time with my faith, just wondering, where God was in all of this sadness and all of this despair that I felt. I was angry that he didn't just heal my dad. I prayed. I remember praying so many nights, why doesn't he just heal him? Why doesn't he just do something to help him, something to bring our family back together? Because, I mean, when I was 5, I had the picture-perfect family in my 5-year-old mind, and I watched as it all just disintegrated. But I know through the scriptures, and I know through experience, that during this time God was not silent. Even though I couldn't understand why he was...
Excuse me, there's some woman staring at us through the door.
Hey. That woman's Amy. Say hi, Amy.
Hi.
But ultimately, I know that there was a purpose for this, and this purpose eventually was so that God could reach out and grab a hold of my life and just really just encourage a lot of people that even through suffering, good can come. Got through high school. High school, like I said, was rough, and made it to college, and I was pretty excited to escape my house and kind of carve my own niche in the world. But when I went away to college, that's when things got really crazy with my dad. My freshman year, my mom would be leaving every other weekend, going to family friends' house, stuff like that, because my dad would get really physical. They'd have fights where they would throw things at each other. My dad would steal money so much that my parents wouldn't have money to pay bills.
I was just wondering, if he got that bad, why didn't you send him to one of those places where they help you get over your addiction?
Well, we tried, but he wouldn't go. You can't send somebody there if they don't want to go.
Ah.
It really reached its worst point beginning of my sophomore year in college. My mom eventually told my dad that she couldn't live with him anymore, and just because it was a safety issue with her, with how much the violence was escalating into physical, that she couldn't live with him anymore. So she eventually moved out, and they were in the process of working out their marriage and trying to just work through their problems. But my dad had mentioned many times in the past that he just wanted to die because of his pain, and had mentioned many times that he had thought about suicide as an option. But none of us really thought much of it, other than just, it was his pain talking. But my sophomore year in college, without any warning, without any real reasoning behind it, I got a phone call one day. It was March 9th of 2009. I got a phone call, and I looked at my phone and I saw that it was my aunt calling, but I was sleeping because it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and I ignored it until I heard knocking on my dorm door, and I heard Fort Myers Police Department open up, and I had no idea why the police were knocking on my door at 9 o'clock in the morning, but I opened the door, and the only thing the police officer could tell me was to please, give your mom a call if there's something going on that you need to be aware of. About that time, my aunt called me, picked up the phone, and I found out through my aunt that my dad had committed suicide. And at this time, I can honestly say that I still wasn't a believer. God was working on my heart, but I was still not a believer, and I was crushed, absolutely, just to the point of where my roommates had to pick me up off the ground and carry me to a car and drive me because I was just so crushed. My anger with God was just at an all-time high at that point. Couldn't see the reasoning behind why he would do this. Still, sometimes, God has really brought me far from that place. Still, a lot of times I don't understand the reasoning for his pain and his struggles. But yeah, going to my dad's funeral was probably one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life. Just it was surreal, and the fact that I never thought that I would be doing this in college. I never thought that, my dad was actually serious when he was threatening these things. But I can honestly say, God really does use horrible situations to bring about good. And as terrible as my father's death was, it reminded me of what was absolutely important. God really just began working in my heart through all the pain and sadness, as he sent, family members to my side just to take care of me, people who actually lived out the gospel and took care of me through it all, and kind of just reminded me of the mortality of everybody and how life really is just short, and just really got me thinking about God again. And up until this point, I closed him out of my mind because I thought that a God who allowed these things just couldn't be good. But slowly but surely, God used this terrible circumstance of my dad's death to just remind me, or just to bring me full circle and make me realize that he is good. And it's only after years of thinking these things through that I can stand up and believe when I say things like that God ultimately is good, because I can see from experience that even though horrible things have happened, it was for good. And a couple of verses that really encouraged me when I had dark moments of just trying to figure out why these things would happen. One was Romans 8:28. I don't know, some of you guys might already know this, but it says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." That includes suffering. Suffering is not exempt from all things work together. Even though we might not understand why he chooses suffering, it does eventually bring us good. And I can see how the horribleness of my father's just pain and struggle has just absolutely shown me how much you have to depend on God for things like that you just don't understand. If you look for reasons, in the world for why these things happen, you're just going to find yourself in hopelessness. But God does ultimately have a purpose for these things. Another verse that was really encouraging to me is Jeremiah 29:11. It says, "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." You can read verses like this and just see that even though we don't see the reasoning, God does have a plan. It doesn't seem like he has a plan, but he does. He actually does. And another verse that really brought me encouragement was Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. It says, "Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him we have also obtained access by faith into the grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. More than that, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." And this verse was just so encouraging to me. And I can see in my own life that suffering, it can be really hard to rejoice in suffering. It is really hard to rejoice in suffering. But suffering produces endurance. And it produces the endurance in us when we realize that we could have never survived these situations on our own. If it was on our own strength, we would have fallen. If it was on my own strength, I would have fallen into despair. I would have fallen into many other pits people fall in when they have these kind of situations. I could have fallen into drug addiction myself, fallen into alcoholism, just fallen into suicide myself if I had been left only with hope in this world and tried to find the power in myself to move forward, to get past this. But we don't have to rely on our own power. We can rely on God's power. He will give us the strength. Our suffering will produce endurance, and endurance will produce character. Character that can remember the things of God and can remember the character of God. That He is loving and that He is justice and that He really honestly cares about us. And that character eventually produces hope because we realize that we couldn't have gotten through these things on our own strength. They were absolutely just God's strength. It took me many, many years, just until the last year of all of the craziness, just to process everything that happened and to look back and be able to say that, I don't understand the reason why God put suffering in my life. I don't, but I know the character of God. I know that He loves me. I know that He has a plan for my life. I know that that plan includes good, and the good that it's going to bring about sometimes comes through suffering. And when I can't understand that, I just need to trust God, and I just need to pray for more faith. I can honestly say the things that happened were not good, but God did use them for good. He used them to strengthen me and to just show me how dependent I am on Him. That's pretty much it, guys.